So, hey everybody, welcome to this week's edition of the Brandcasters Podetize private client coaching webinar. And I am not in our office. I am in the state of New York right now, Westchester County, Upper Westchester County, New York, at my mother's place. I was here came to East for the 4th of July holiday, and hope everybody had a great 4th. So here we are, and I'm just going to restart this as if it was new. So today is a tech day, tech call, and there are some recent things that have been happening that I'm very concerned about for a lot of podcasters out there. And we've talked about some of these subjects in the past, but there's a new twist on some of it this time. And really, it's about radio shows, radio networks, internet radio in particular, and how we are finding some of them really doing their clients a disservice when it comes to what they do to repurpose the radio show as a podcast. And in particular, I've had a couple of new prospective customers coming to me and having some calls, and they're, under a contract, they prepaid for the year, and they then tend to have a lot of resistance when, they encounter us and we help share with them all of the best practices for how to get the most out of their podcast, and how most often the radio network is acting more in their own best interest than it is the interest of you, the host of the show. And that's not always the case. I will say I've seen some exceptions. This is not absolutely universal, but I see it happening more often than not. And one of the things that a particular radio network did recently with this potential customer was to let them know that if they left the radio network, that the radio network owned their Spotify account and their iHeartRadio account, and they would lose all of those listeners if they left the radio network. And I've never encountered any radio network or even any other podcast producer really threatening such a thing with a potential customer, all for just threatening, not even threatening, but just talking about, hey, my needs are not being met and served by you, the radio network. They're not being completely met and served. And here are my needs. I need to get more out of my show. And, most of the time they'll cooperate. And sometimes I've experienced clients staying with and working with the radio network and then repurposing it as a podcast and working with us to do their blog posts and even host them on, all the different podcast distribution channels so they can do ad insertion and things like that, or split their show up into multiple feeds if they have different categories of episodes. There's a lot of different opportunities and things that you can do. But this particular radio network was really resisting this this client of theirs leaving, and in a very, I would say, not in a they were resisting them and acting really all in their own best interest as a radio network, not acting in the best interest of their host, the podcast or the radio show host. Again, I caution everybody, if you're getting involved in a radio network or internet radio or terrestrial radio, whatever it is, if you're getting involved with a company like that and considering working with them, you've got to look carefully at your contract. And number one, make sure you own all of the content. Anything that's recorded, that's your voice, you own it. You're allowed to repurpose it whichever way you want. There are some radio contracts that if you work with them, they own the content, and you don't even have the right to rebroadcast it on your own website or convert it to a blog post or anything. So that's terribly unfortunate when you get into one of those situations. But then the other big challenge is about this issue about the radio network owning your listing on Spotify or iHeart or iTunes. You definitely do not want that situation. And at Brandcasters and Podetize, we are very clear with all of our customers and our potential customers right up front. You own all the content. You own the listings. And if you need to make a move, we are going to assist you in that transition. We're not going to resist it. I mean, it doesn't help anybody to try to force someone to stay somewhere they're not happy. Now, in reality, we don't see it happening very often that people leave us, but I'm sure it will happen. But the reality is, you know what? You have to make sure that in your contract, you own your listing on Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, and you have control of it. Now, there is a convenience factor when you launch a podcast with us, or if you transition to Podetize, and you are not on all of the different podcast distribution platforms. We are going to put you there so you get maximum exposure. We're going to make sure you're on all the places you need to be. But at the end of the day, that listing is yours. We just facilitate registering it, making it happen. We do technically have control over it in some way, yes, but that control is always given back to you, the host, the owner of the show, whenever that's needed. But a lot of times people like to have us have control of it because when there's a problem, we have more direct lines of communication in at some of these distribution networks and can help troubleshoot and solve problems. Like, for instance, we've had people that had their show delisted from iTunes for a technical reason, something that was out of compliance with their feed. It is much easier for us to fix that problem if we have control over the feed and are able to communicate on your behalf with the network. So that's just an example of why it makes some sense. But at the end of the day, it's yours, and you're free to do with it what you want. So this radio network now, another thing that this potential customer is experiencing with the internet radio network is they're claiming that they're getting much, much more exposure through them as a radio network than they will ever get with just a podcast. Now, I have to admit, I approach that statement with a bit of doubt and skepticism. In my experience, when radio networks talk about, how much exposure your show will get on their network, they're using the number of all of the listeners they may have on their network over an entire month, because it's a much bigger number than how many people are actually listening to your show. So that tends to be a bit of a bait and switch, and you want to be careful with that one too. So that if you have, let's say the radio network says they have, over 3 million monthly listeners or monthly listens, right? Well, if they have the same people listening to their radio network every day of the month, then that's, roughly 30 days. And, you could divide that 3 million number by 30. And now all of a sudden you're at like maybe 100,000 actual listeners, in terms of unique listeners. And then how many of them are actually listening to your show at the time you're broadcasting it? The whole idea of putting out a radio show the same time every week, or even if it's, 2 or 3 days a week, but at a certain time of day, whenever you do that, you're going to limit the number of people that would ever be possibly listening to your content. And really, this is why podcasts are so popular, right? I mean, it's why it's become, it continues to trend higher and higher, and terrestrial radio and internet radio listeners continue to decline because people want to listen on their schedule. They don't want to listen when you have a show at a certain time. I mean, take this client coaching call today on tech issues. Today, this is, we do this every week about this time and about this time of day, but very few people attend it live. That's why we put it out on the Facebook group so that there it's preserved and recorded and it can be watched at any time. And it's why we also have it available usually on a replay, although I think with the Facebook group, we no longer need to do that. But very few people are listening actually live. Now, the advantage of listening live is if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat and I'll be happy to address them right now. So Whitney, if you're listening and still there, if you have any questions regarding this, please feel free, type it in the chat, and you get some of my time undivided because you're attending this live. But not everybody can do that. And podcast listenership is the same way. People want to listen on their schedule, not on yours. So I really have a tough time with radio shows. And there was another myth that this radio show company was telling this customer of theirs that was contemplating leaving and moving to Podetize. And they were claiming that because the radio network has a larger profile on the internet with Google than their individual website does, the client's website, that from an SEO perspective, the client is much better off staying with them in the radio show because more people will find them through Google search. And, when I read that, and this was delivered to me in email, I have to admit, I kind of chuckled, which I know it's not really a laughing matter if this is your show and you're trying to figure out what it was, but I'd never heard that kind of an argument before by a radio show company, that because their show is available because the client's show is available on their network, that it's more easily searchable or findable by people searching in Google than if they weren't on the radio network. And this I actually absolutely know from long, hard experience is not true. Because the reality is, doesn't matter if it's a podcast episode that started as a radio show or started as a podcast and then it's put out as a radio show over an internet radio network, that show is only searchable by the words that are contained in the title or in the description of that episode. And that is universal across just about every search bar that exists, whether you're on a podcast platform, a radio show platform, or even Google, for your MP3 file, for your episode of your show. The only way that you really get the most value out of your show and get the greatest SEO value is if that MP3 file is converted to text, to a written form, put in a blog post on your website. And then you get the most value for that because Google will recognize it's a blog post. They will analyze all the words that were from what was said in the episode. And they will then associate that, your post with anybody who searches on any phrases that even come close to aligning with what was said in your episode. Your post comes up in the search, people click, they end up on your website. If they didn't know you had a podcast, they learn you do. They can listen right there on your website. And if they're a regular podcast listener or want to become one, they can go subscribe on their favorite channel. Radio networks don't do this. They don't spend that kind of time converting what you say in the radio show or in the podcast into written form to make that searchable. So they're not really doing you as much of a service. Even if their website ranks higher than your website in general, and let's say maybe if you typed a search term that was in the title of your episode, and maybe that if somebody searches on that term, maybe that episode would come up high in Google search, and maybe on the radio network it would come up above the listing on iTunes or the listing on Google Podcasts or wherever you have your podcast distributed. That may be, but I would argue what you really want to be coming up for in search, the real SEO value, is in coming up in search for all the hundreds or even thousands of different things that are said, the different phrases of words that are said in each episode that you publish. The only way you're going to do that is converting it into written form. There's just no other way it happens. And we call that verbal SEO at Podetize and Brandcasters. So verbal SEO is a phrase, a term that we coined to really describe what we do in converting your audio show into a written form. And it really is in your best interest. And another word about ranking. Here's the thing. I don't ever care, and nor should you ever care, whether your website comes up in Google search for your own website's URL, or even your company name, or maybe even your name. Now, quite honestly, most often it should come up for those things in Google search. It should come up for your name if you've got your name properly put onto your website enough times on the About page and on a lot of the other pages. Your website should come up for your own name. And yeah, if you know the URL of a website and you Google that, sure, your URL should come up. But I always think when somebody says that to me, oh, my site always comes up number one in Google search when you type in the name of my company, or you type in my name, which is the same as my website URL. Well, I'm sort of think, okay, so what? It does, fine. But the reality is that if somebody's already searching on your name or your company name, you've already won the battle. You know, because they know who you are. They really don't need to search for you. And if they do, of course, your website's going to come up. What you want is for your website to come up, for you to come up, for your show to come up in Google search for all the hundreds and thousands of different things that people are searching on in Google search bar every day that align with what you or your guests talk about in your episodes. That's what you want. And Google does not discriminate when it comes to this in terms of organic keyword ranking of phrases that are in your blog posts compared to another site's blog posts, right? They don't care. They don't care how big the other website is. They don't care how small or new your website is, as long as it's not brand new. It takes 3 or 4 months for Google to start to trust your website and to for it to come out of what's known as the Google sandbox. And that's basically just, it's new. Google doesn't trust it yet. They don't know how much content you're going to put out. They don't know the quality of the content until you start doing it on a regular basis. They don't know. But once you do, they do. They know and they trust it. And then your new blog posts get indexed and ranked the same day that they're put up on your website. It happens very quickly. We've tracked it, and I have case studies of this. If you're interested, let me know, and we can talk about that. But here's the thing. So those radio networks, internet radio networks, are never going to create such a comprehensive blog post and put it on your website for you. If they did spend that much time, they would put it on their website because they want to benefit from it. And this is the whole point. Radio networks are struggling to remain relevant, and they are generally losing listenership where podcasting is gaining listenership, and they're struggling for relevance. And so they want, yes, as many people to stay on their platform as possible, because if you're on their platform, you're helping attract listeners to them. But it really benefits them more than it does you. And everything we're all about here at Podetize and Brandcasters is making you the center of influence, you the authority. You get all the benefit. We don't want it. We want all of this work that we do on your episodes to serve you and help you market and grow your brand, your business. So that verbal SEO process to the blog post does that. Like I said, Google doesn't discriminate. Google will make it, will rank anybody's content if it's good content. Now, maybe at first it might be on the second or third page of Google, but as Google starts to see you're putting out that same kind of quality content every week on a regular basis, you'll start to move up in those rankings, and that will change over time. You'll eventually move up to the second page and move up to the first page. And sometimes if Google understands your website and knows and trusts you enough, your post, the day that it is posted, will be indexed and ranked and put on the first page of Google search. We see this happen with our clients' posts and our own posts every week. It absolutely happens. Just depends on the search term, how much competition there is for it, how much demand there is for the search term. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So, we can't guarantee where you're going to end up, but the more content you create, the better off you will be, the higher you will rank. And obviously, the more consistently you put out content, the same thing, the higher you will rank. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you today, especially having this experience with a potential client who is really being sold a bill of goods by a radio show network. And that was so disappointing to hear. And, they tried to poke all sorts of holes in the value that we provide, or we would potentially provide to this potential client who was considering coming to work with us. And you know what? I understand that kind of defensiveness from a radio network, and when people lose a customer, it's a tough thing to deal with. But the reality is, people need to meet their own needs. Their own needs to be seen, heard, and found, and to grow it, market, and grow their businesses. And at the end of the day, their needs aren't being met where they are. They're going to move on. Resisting that isn't going to help anything. And trying to penalize them by holding their listings on Spotify and iHeart hostage, like I mentioned earlier, it's just not going to end up in a good place. It's not going to be good for anybody. So I'm sorry some people out there are experiencing that. And there are things we can do, because we do have high-level contacts at iHeart and Spotify to help essentially move those listings from the control of the radio show to your control. And, we would always try to assist you with that. So anyway, that's about all that I had to share with you today for this tech call. Again, pardon my background. I'm outdoors in New York at my mother's place from the long weekend. And there's a couple of people attending live here on Zoom. If you have a question, this is your opportunity to ask it. And anybody that is watching live on Facebook, if you have a comment, feel free. Let's see, Scott Carson says that stinks. Paul Height, you're back. Well, I'm back. Yeah, I'm back. I don't know if that's I'm back because we had a broadcast fail in the first minute of this broadcast, or if I'm back broadcasting. I'm not sure what you meant, but hey, yes, I'm back. Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. And I'm in New York, not back in California. I'll be back next week in California. So no questions from Whitney. Okay. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Whitney. Thank you so much for joining live today and every Wednesday. And you should, if you're on the calendar, if you're attached to our calendar, as a client, you should automatically have these appointments coming up in your calendar to let you know when we're doing these live, private, client-only coaching calls. Even though it's on Facebook, that's a private, closed group. So David has a question. And yes, David, I know you. I remember you well. You're just starting a podcast. What's the best way to invite guests when there's no established shows? You know what? Really good question, David. And I'll tell you, if your potential guests have any experience with podcasting at all or being guests on podcast, they should know, even if your show doesn't have an established audience, being one of the first 5, 6, even 10 guests on a show is very valuable to them as a guest, because you'll find 6 months from now, a year from now, when people find your show new, they listen to your most recent episode or two, and then they like it. They say, well, it's a great show. They're going to go back and start listening from the beginning, as long as your content, the episodes, those interviews are still relevant. And I would say they probably would be. It's more likely than not that they would still be relevant. So they're going to go back and listen to the beginning. Those first few episodes of any show are always going to get more plays than later shows. It's just the way it tends to happen. It's a recurring trend we see in new podcasts and growing podcasts. So you can use that as an incentive for someone to be your premier guest, your first episode, or one of your foundational guests, one of your early guests in your show for the first 6. You can get away with that for 6 or even 10 or 12 episodes saying that, because it's true. And, only time will prove that out, and you'll see it in the numbers yourself. But go ahead and sell that to them that, hey, the early episodes get listened to the most across most podcasts. You have the opportunity to be one of my first guests, and you probably won't have them say no in reality. So don't be afraid to ask and to pitch that. And then when you get some of those first good guests in those early episodes, you use them as the sort of living testimonial being published on your show, on your podcast, in your blog, to say, hey, look, these other guests found value in being on my show. You will too. And don't you want to be like them? It's sort of, the benefit of association, those guests being associated with your show brand. And then, the other guests saying, hey, don't you want to be associated with my show just like these other people were? I mean, you don't say it quite that way when you're talking to them, but that's the idea. So don't be afraid to invite guests. You're going to give them the unique opportunity to be one of the premier guests of your show. And I think you'll get good response to that. And then, if you still have trouble with it, reach out to us and we'll help you. All right, good. Glad you appreciated that. Just going to check Facebook again, see if we got any more. Here we have a question from Facebook. Are there any advantages to an internet radio show versus a podcast? Um, Paul, good question. The only the only advantage is if that radio network truly has a large audience that is not listening to podcasts anywhere. If it's truly a different audience. And whether it is or not, I'm sure is a debatable point, and it depends on the radio network. It depends on the trends in listenership, how many people tune in live versus don't. But I'll tell you this, if a radio network is wanting you to be exclusive to them, I would run the other direction. If they are cooperative and willing to be complimentary to your podcast, then, and it's not too expensive, if you're paying any cost, whatever that cost is worth it to you to experiment and see if you get more exposure from it, then by all means try it. I don't personally have a problem with having podcast episodes also rebroadcast or broadcast at the same time, even you record it as a radio show. I don't have a problem with it. My big issue is if the radio show tries to take complete control over your content, if they own it, if they claim to own it, and if they are going to restrict you in any way. If they're, like some of the things I said earlier in this broadcast, if they're going to claim ownership over your listings on iTunes and Spotify and iHeart, those are deal breakers as far as I'm concerned. So I would not get involved in those relationships. And I also would not get in one, like I said, if it's exclusive and they want you to be on the radio show and do not want you at all to be out on podcast distribution networks, or if they want to be the only ones who are in control of putting you there, that's usually to serve their best interest. Your podcast episode, when it's published, will probably have commercials in it for their radio network. Your listing on iTunes will probably say that it is produced by them, that it's put out by them. We see this all the time with radio networks, and those kinds of things are not in your best interest for your brand. So advantages are just reach, if they truly have more reach, and are giving you more exposure that you're not going to get otherwise. So that's that. Let's see. Oh, I got one more question here over Zoom. Start with 10 initial podcasts on. Oh, it says, so David is saying, I think you mentioned to start with 10 initial podcasts on launch day, then to the normal schedule. When on a normal schedule, how many episodes should you always have done in advance? Good question. I have recommendation for this. There's no absolute rule. So bear that in mind. Everybody does it differently. And, sort of the old cliche, the different strokes for different folks is really true. But my recommendation would be, depending on how many episodes you're going to publish per week, if that's 1 or 2 or 3, whatever it is. And we have people at Podetize doing everything from publishing every other week, which I really don't recommend, because I don't think that frequency is enough. But some people, that's what they want to do, and it's their show. They're welcome to do it. But we have people doing from everywhere from, once every other week. Once a week is probably the most common in terms of people, but we have people publishing 2, 3, 5, and even 7 days a week. We have more than one client now publishing actually 7 days a week. So you're planning on 1 day a week, which is great. That's the minimum we would recommend. So you're going to publish 1 a week. You want to know how far ahead should you be? I would recommend you try to get a month ahead. Okay. And try to stay there. You can't always stay there, but depending on your travel schedule and how busy you are in business, I would recommend recording in batches. So beyond the first 10 or so, you're going to publish on day 1, right? So on a regular basis, recording after that, you have, I would schedule, if you're going to have guests, take 1 day a month. And maybe it's 1 afternoon a month if you can't do the whole day, but 1 day a month, and offer up all those times to your guests, however many you can book in that day, I could probably book 6 to 8 in a day if I wanted to. 6 is probably on the high side. 4 is more common. But then I might record a couple solo casts in between some of those interviews that are just me giving my nuggets of wisdom and information to my audience, just direct from me without a guest. You can do sort of a mix. But schedule 1 day a month. And if you need 2 days a month, then do it in 2 days. Schedule all those guests, record them in a batch, get it done, and submit those episodes as soon as possible for production. And then we will go and produce them ahead. I mean, yes, we have a 7-day turnaround time for an episode submitted this week that needs to publish next week. And if you're submitting one that's more than a week out, that's like 2 weeks out or 3 weeks out, we might take up to 10 days to get that done. That's, if you have questions about that, you can talk with me or Alexandra, because we have an established SOP for production, because we always need to give priority to those episodes submitted this week that have to publish next week. Those have to be first priority. And then after that, whatever capacity we have within that week, we will go and get ahead. With every show, we like to be 4 weeks ahead in production. And it gives you time to review everything in detail and request any, minor edits or changes that you need well in advance of any show publishing. So we're not in a last minute firefight or trying to catch up if you find there's a problem late in the game. But it also gives you breathing room to record. And if you get to the point where you always are hopefully 4, maybe 5, even 6 episodes ahead, then you have time. You don't have to do it for a few weeks, right? And you're going to travel. You don't feel pressure of, oh my gosh, I got to record. I got to get that next episode submitted. And don't get me wrong, we have people that just by the nature of their show, either what they're recording, what their subject matter is, or who they are and how their time is and how they schedule their time. A lot of people are recording just in time and submitting the week before and doing one at a time. And they never really get 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead. And if that works for them, that's fine. It does work for some people. I'm the type of person that likes to get way ahead. And when I'm not ahead, I get sort of anxious about it. It's like, oh my gosh, I have this pressure. I got to record. And then maybe I don't record my best, if I'm under pressure like that. So, pardon me, it's a really long-winded answer to your question. I think your goal should be try to get a month ahead at least, maybe more, and then you can record on your schedule, not on the calendar's schedule, if that makes any sense. So there is that. See if I have any more questions. Looks like I don't have any more on Facebook. Are there any more? And check back to Zoom. And if not, I am going to, I got another one. Should you break things up into seasons? That's a personal style choice. I personally never did that with any of my podcasts. I tended to do a perpetual podcast that just kept going week after week with new episodes. One of them, my first one, had 550 some odd episodes, never did seasons over the course of 5 years. And then my other ones are up to, 100 or 150. It depends on the podcast. Never did seasons. But there's nothing wrong with seasons. You're welcome to do it. It depends with the kind of content you have. If it makes sense to you to group them into seasons, if all of those episodes of a season have kind of a journey you're taking the listener through that has a beginning, middle, and end and kind of makes sense that way, it may be perfectly appropriate to put them into seasons. And then for others, here's what I think works best, honestly, with breaking up a show into different groupings of shows. And I guess in the podcast world, because podcasts are evergreen, they're always there. People can find them 6 months, a year from now, and it's new to them. Calling it season 1, season 2, season 3 may make people feel like, oh, they missed out. They're really far behind, even though they really are. You want people to have a sense of anticipation that, wow, this is great content. I want to experience it. I get to experience it. And you don't really want to ground it as old or outdated, unless it really is old and outdated, I guess. So I would suggest you can split shows into different classifications. You know, if your subject matter has a lot of really good content you're going to record that are foundational subjects, you know, industry terms you're defining, beginner best practices, 101 series, think of it like that. If you have some of your episodes that are going to be that, then it may very well make sense after a period of time. I would always publish everything in your main one podcast show identity and feed to start. And then as you start to get 25, 50 episodes, you start to get up like that, you could take a series of 10 or 12 and copy that off into another show identity that maybe is, you know, when you're new to this podcast, start here first. Get the foundational education, experience, whatever that is, and then continue with the rest of it. That's one good way to break something up into another feed. And then you could also do, if you have interview episodes different from solo casts, you know, you could highlight the interview episodes and put them into their own feed. Keep in mind, you can still keep everything in the main feed where most of your people are subscribed from the beginning. And then you have these additional show identities, subsets of your shows. And another great one is if you want to do an event series. If you put on events in your business, if you go to events and you just want to take the opportunity to interview as many people at that event as possible, you could actually give that event some exposure, maybe even get them to be a sponsor of the show for that series, and they can get a little more exposure out of it and maybe kick in a little money to help, you know, with some of the production of your show. And because they're going to continue to get the kind of exposure if you present it that way. Now, if they don't want to pay, you certainly don't have to. You can give the event series a name that's different and has nothing to do with the event if the organizers aren't going to sort of cooperate and participate with you. But you have the option. And so there are many different kinds of series of episodes you could do. And if you have different subject matters, like we have a relatively new podcaster who's doing a show about relationships, and he's breaking it into a few different kinds of relationships: pre-marriage, you know, or maybe even dating, but engaged, but not married yet, married, and then maintaining marriage. Now that's an expansive array of topics, and chances are any listener is going to be interested in one of those 4 topic areas and not necessarily wanting to listen to all of them, because they've either been there if they're later in their marriage and they don't need dating, you know, tips or advice or subjects to be discussed. You know, so that's a good one where I think breaking it up into different classifications of episodes can be really helpful to serve more people, give them the content that they really need and want faster. But I would still have it all in the main feed. So you're welcome, David. I'm glad that was helpful to you. All right. Facebook still has no more comments. I think we're going to wrap this pretty soon. So my pleasure to help all of you that are here live. Thank you for participating live. Thank you for typing your questions into the chat. It's always more fun to do this when you have really real people participating, giving you some feedback or asking questions. It makes what I do here much more valuable to you and more real for everybody else listening on Facebook. So thanks, everybody. I think I'm signing off for this one. I will be back next time. Next week. Watch your calendar. And if you're not on the calendar for these private client coaching calls on the Brandcasters Facebook group, which is a private group, reach out to help@podetize.com or hello@podetize.com, either one of those, and let them know what you're requesting, and Alexandra or someone else on the team will reply and get you the calendar link to add over. Okay? So thanks very much. I hope everybody had a great 4th, and we'll talk to you next week.